I'm Tom Canetti, and welcome to Uncensored Stories. We're welcomed by Atar. Thanks for joining us, mate.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about Israeli politics. Can we start by talking about the army and the significance of the army and the conscription process in Israel?
In Israel, for those that don't know, the army is mandatory. There is a conscription, so once you turn 18, you have to go to the military, both for guys and girls. It's for two years and 8 months for guys and 2 years for girls. Obviously, you can stay longer if you sign on an agreement. In reality, it's like there's the model of the army of the nation, which was kind of an early Zionist idea of the melting pot, of putting all of the, making the new Israelis, because Israel was a young country when all of the people immigrated here from all over. So Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, he thought of the army as kind of a melting pot for all of the different populations. So right now, it's not really everyone actually goes to the military. Like a lot of people either drop out early or don't go at all. So now I think it's like 48% of the population actually finishes their military service.
Do you need a specific reason to drop out?
Yeah. Like if girls are religious, so many girls are religious, or some of them pretend to be religious, you can drop out, well, for mental issues or physical issues, or if you're religious, there's some arrangement with like yeshivas, which is like the schools for the ultra-Orthodox where they study. So they also have some arrangement where they don't go to the military.
What's the general sentiment amongst young people who are conscripted and have to spend that time in the military? Because it does seem quite hard. You know, it's not having to prove mental issues, or if you're going to study Orthodox, it's not that easy to prove, right? It's not an easy way to get out. So are people frustrated, or they feel like it's necessary?
Well, I'll tell you what. I don't know how much I represent the general opinion in Israel. I think the general opinion is moving towards my opinion, but I believe in a professional military. I'm against forcing people to go to the army, because if you don't go, they can put you in prison. They let you go, after like 3 months, but you still have to go to prison without doing anything wrong. And a lot of the military positions are just there because it's like a general conscription. So we've got army magicians and army mind readers and army bands. And right now, when celebrities are getting younger and younger, like every other week, there is like a new scandal. It was like 19-year-old singer. We have a singer, her name is Adibiti, and she released like a provocative video. And she's like a singer, she's a famous singer, but she's in the military. So like they got pissed at her, and it happens all the time. A lot of people are trying to get off, and I think more and more people realize that the military has to defend the nation, not just be there for entertainment purposes. Because I think it's ridiculous that we have military bands and people that like their entire job is to entertain other soldiers. Yeah,
for sure. And on the note of defending the nation, let's talk about the Iron Dome, I believe it's called. So can you talk us through that system and sort of what that entails, like how people feel having so many missiles constantly coming into Israel?
Yeah, definitely. So as you know, Israel is not in a very friendly neighborhood. So in the past few years, Hamas, which is the terrorist organization that controls Gaza, they sent missiles on civilian populations. So the Iron Dome is actually a system that was developed by Rafael, which is like an Israeli defense company. I think they have contracts with the states. And it's a system that intercepts missiles. I think like it sends its missiles, then it explodes near the Hamas missile, and basically neutralizes it. We also have other systems for like different ranges. We've got like the Patriot, the Arrow. They had like a new system that was tested with the states in Alaska, I think like a year ago. But it definitely improved the defense of people in the South. I mean, it's like 85% success or 90% success.
There's
It's
still, you're saying it's 85 and 90% successful. So how often do missiles still come through and successfully enter Israel?
well, look, it depends on the time. Right now, it's quite like quiet time. The last time we had an operation was in 2014 in the Protective Edge operation. But like every few months, there is an escalation. So like many times when it doesn't intercept, like lands in open areas, so like no one is hurt. But the system is definitely improved the security of people. I mean, like 15 years ago, people had missiles falling down their homes and like killing families.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
Have you ever had to evacuate anywhere?
Uh, Me personally, I live in Jerusalem, so like the only times we heard sirens was like during the 2014 operations, but other than that, it's like pretty safe down here.
Okay. Do you think there's a psychological effect, sort of being on edge that they're coming into your country where you live?
Tom, can you repeat the question? It was a bit fragmented.
Yeah, you broke up. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Okay, so what do you think the psychological of? Yeah, I can hear you. What do you think the psychological effect of knowing that there are so many missiles constantly trying to come into Israel? What psychological effect do you think that has on Israelis?
Can you hear me now? Right, you can hear me now before I answer the question.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Well, Israel is like, I think like in a constant state of readiness, and you know, it depends on the time, but if like you're in the middle of an operation, everyone's like really stressed out. So it's like really, you know, your parents have like memories of like 20 years ago when the security situation here was really bad. So you see everyone afraid to, you know, leave their house. But it depends where. Obviously, it changes from person to person. But I feel it's just like everyone's in a constant state of shock, yeah, it just really sucks. I mean, people are just really stressed out.
Saying that, like every Israeli that I've met, I've never been to Israel, but overseas, are always so jolly and they're always very happy. And a lot of them say that they use humor to sort of get past that fear.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
as well as partying, like Israel is supposed to be
yeah.
a great country to party.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like for Westerners to like, if I would tell you that, you know, like you can get missiles on your country, it sounds terrible and is terrible, but in a very sick way, you kind of get used to it. So it's not that bad as as it sounds. I mean, it is bad, but it's kind of sad, but you have to get used to it.
Okay, let's talk about the general sentiment between young Israelis and the Arab community. Talk us through how you sort of feel, what's it been like growing up in Israel, and what the general sentiment's been.
Well, Israel is very diverse, so I guess it depends where you grow up in Israel. But the Arab population is 21% of Israel. So obviously Arabs are a minority, so there are problems of a minority like in every other state. So you know, there's also problems of racism, but a lot of Arabs do manage to integrate into society. So it's really different because, you know, Arab society is very tribal. So it depends like if the tribe is loyal to Israel or not loyal, kind of. I mean, you've got the Druze that they go to the military, and also the Bedouins, and then you've got like more hostile communities. So it really depends. But yeah, like, every other minority, I think they're I think the situation is getting better, like, in my opinion.
That's what I was going to ask. So how has how have those relations, we'll get more into the specifics later on, but how have those relations changed, if they have, throughout your lifetime?
Um, well, I live in Jerusalem, so it's kind of like the microcosmos of Israel. Jerusalem is like very multicultural. I mean, we've got Arabs, we've got ultra Orthodox, we've got secular people. Um, I have to say, like, a lot of times in Israel, the communities are separate. It's kind of sad, but I didn't get to see like much. I didn't get much interaction. Like, the most Arabs that I got to get close to was like in university. I mean, because my school, like in my school, we had Arabs, but there was very, very small proportion. So you've got like Arab towns, and it just happens organically. I mean, some towns are intermingled, like Haifa and Jerusalem. So sometimes you do have like the populations get to be with each other, but a lot of times it's kind of each one wants to do their own thing, like culture-wise, and
Yeah. Are there certain misconceptions about the Israeli community, maybe from the Western world, politically or socially? Because even you telling me that like 20% of Israel is Arab is quite shocking to me. Like, coming from an uneducated point of view, I guess you don't think that that's the case. Are there certain misconceptions you think about Israelis?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, Israel doesn't have like a very good rep in the Western world, and mostly like in progressive circles. I'm not sure how it is in Australia. I mean, um,
It's
but
not so. It's yeah. I've only really recently realized that since I've moved to Europe and visiting play. I live in Barcelona, so Catalonia is very free Palestine, and I went to Northern Ireland. There's always graffiti saying "Free Palestine" as well.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
they're known for that, and there are reasons for that. I mean, look, Israel gets a bad rep because it's sometimes seen as like a colonial power, and people like in Catalonia that like see themselves as like a nation being occupied by Spain, they might sympathize with like the Palestinian narrative, and also people from Ireland. Obviously, the reality is much more complex, and there is kind of like a battle of narratives between like Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, like there's even basically it's like if you want to get people in the West to like you, you have to seem like a victim. I guess like the Palestinian. I guess the Palestinian strategy has been to like portray Israel as a colonial power, and many people in the West have like a very deep weight with like colonialism, and they see Israel as like a Western country, like a strong one occupying like the weak one. So it's much easier to kind of like to sympathize with the underdog if you're not very knowledgeable about the conflict, and say its nuances and how complicated it is. And I guess that's why many people sympathize with it. So there are a lot of misconceptions, and I think the BDS movement. I don't know how big it is in Spain, or how your
which movement, sorry?
BDS. The BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction. It's
Can
basically
you talk about
it's a movement that tries to like its ideology is it was made by Palestinians. Its ideology is like trying to end Israel. I know it sounds very harsh, but basically its entire ideology is trying to boycott Israel and try to like bring a just solution. And a lot of times, like in the Palestinian narrative, it's trying to reel back the wheels of history and try to kind of eliminate Israel. So the BDS movement, it says Israel is like an apartheid state, or a colonial power, and it's actually very like a big topic in Israel. There are a lot of Israelis going on kind of delegations trying um, to talk about Israel from like a different perspective. It's called in Israel hasbara. It's hasbara. There's no English word for it. It's basically means to explain. It's like giving a defense to your side, because a lot of the Palestinian propaganda, it depicts Israeli military as I don't know, as killers and stuff like that. And then a lot of when Israeli soldiers, you know, young people like me, I'm 22 years old, and you know, like other people my age go to the States or other like progressive colleges and talk about their military service, they might be seen as like war criminals and stuff like that. So it's it's in my opinion, it's very counterproductive. This you know, propaganda that also is in many times untruthful. Most of it is untruthful.
It's interesting, the shift between the conception of Jews in the 20th century to in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So once that suffering sort of ends to some extent and there's no longer a minority or the underdog, it does seem that that preconception of that race seems to change for the poorer.
Yeah, definitely. I like it makes sense. Like everyone wants to be, you know, like sympathize with the underdog, and I think it's kind of like the simplistic worldview. I think like the more nuanced worldview is you know, trying to understand the history and like who's like you know, the aggressors. And you know, our conflict, it's, I think one of the sad things about it is that it's always portrayed as like in a very dichotomic, like you're either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, which is, I think it's very counterproductive, because I think the interest of peace is always the interest of both peoples. And we'll surely talk about, you know, the new countries that normalized their relations with Israel. But I think that this, you know, like view of like two camps, it's, you can't have like a serious conversation with that. It's just basically very tribal. It's like you're with us or you're against us. So
sure.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the foundation of Israel as a nation state?
The foundation of Israel, you mean like the history, or like
yeah.
It's okay. So Israel is actually the culmination of the Zionist movement. So the Zionist movement, it started in the 19th century in Europe with Theodor Herzl. And the basic idea of Zionism in one sentence is finding a Jewish homeland for Jews, where it's like a safe haven, where it's, you know, they wouldn't get persecuted, wouldn't go through pogroms. Obviously, the Holocaust, actually, the Zionist movement, you know, it was like on its ways before the Holocaust. The Holocaust just, I think, maybe strengthened the cause, because, you know, it gave like a clear example of what happens when like Jews don't have protection. So the main idea is finding a place where Jews like can be Jews, like not withhold their identity, and be safe in a national homeland. So it's part of the 19th century renaissance of national movements all over Europe, also in Italy and in Spain, and other places as well. Israel, you know, cut me short if you want me to kind of make it brief.
No, go on.
Okay, so Israel was, you know, like the Zionist movement kept bringing people to Israel. In the beginning, it was under Ottoman rule. It was the Ottoman Empire. And then after the First World War concluded, the British controlled the land, and they got their mandate from the League of Nations, which was the body preceding the UN. They got like a mandate back then. They wanted to give like the powers that won the war more places to control. And the idea was decolonization, like give mandate for a certain period of time. And then when the place is self-sufficient to have its own government, then they'll leave. And it happened, you know, in other places as well. Well, Australia was also part of like the British Commonwealth. It still is part of the British Commonwealth, but used to be a British colony as well. So Arabs were living here, and Jews also were living here, but a lot of more Jews came from like Europe and Yemen, all over the world. And basically, the idea was to create a state, like eventually. But the British were still here, and also the Arabs were still here. And the Arabs also wanted, a state, as like it was kind of like a counter reaction to the Zionist movement. Like in the beginning of the 20s, there also began kind of like the Palestinian nationalism, or like kind of their idea for having their own state, because back then, like Iraq was founded, and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, so kind of the national idea also was kind of coming into the Arab world as well. I mean, the Arab world is not national in like the European sense, where like the French have been French for hundreds of years, but they started to adopt it as well. And then obviously,
was there something that sparked that?
Well, I think if you see like a lot of Jews coming in, and like Jews had like a lot of institutions back then. It was like one of the most organized places under like a mandate. I think it's unprecedented, because like the Jewish, we call it like the Jewish yeshuv. Yeshuv is like, or like city, kind of like the Jews here. They had like democratic institutions like Congress, and it's like like it's analogous to like the Indians having their own Congress before the British left. Like they had the party called Congress, but they didn't have like a parliament. So obviously, there are also a lot of issues, ethnic tensions between Jews and Arabs, also in Israel and the British. I mean, it's basically there are terror attacks from both sides. Each side wanted to liberate the land. So you had two opposing national movements. And then the UN decided to divide the land into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, in its decision 181 in the 29th of November 1947. And that's called the partition plan. And then broke out the War of Independence. Obviously, Israel won. And it wasn't only against the Palestinian Arabs. I mean, it was against like 7 different armies, one of which was Sudan, which we recently normalized relations with. Jordan, all the surrounding countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, and I think other militias as well. And that's how Israel was founded, like at the midst of war. So also all the institutions were kind of put in place during wartime. But that's like a brief overview of, like.
And when was that? When was that?
That's 48. Like the war broke out in 47 and ended in 49. But Israel was declared on like in May 1948.
Yep. And so tensions since then, have they been revolved mainly around the division of land?
So I think it's a common misconception, in my view, also in the West, also in Israel, that the tensions are around land. I think the conflict, it's much more complicated than that. Obviously, you've got the religious aspect. So, it's like Judaism and Islam. I mean, Jerusalem is like kind of the place with the most amount of tensions. I mean, when we had terrorist attacks, like the worst were in Jerusalem, and one of the reasons is that like many of the holy places are in Jerusalem. I mean, I don't know if you know the Dome of the Rock. It's like one of the places. I think it's like the 3rd holiest place for Muslims, and you've also got like the Western Wall, which is the holiest place for Jews, and you've also got the Church of the Sepulchre, which is one of the holiest places for Christians. It's where supposedly Jesus was buried and went up to the sky. It's So you've got this aspect, and obviously you've got the cultural aspect and the ethnic aspect. I mean, it's kind of a clash. The way I see it is a clash between civilizations, kind of. Samuel Huntington's description in his book Clash of the Civilizations. I don't know if you know the book, but Israel is very much like a Western country. You know, it's based on Judeo-Christian values, and the Arab world is based on Muslim values. So it's a clash of civilizations from every aspect, not just the religious and ethnic. It's sociological. It's the way society is organized. It's around so many different aspects. So I think land is one of it, but it's in my opinion not like the most. It's not like the prominent one, because otherwise we'd have had peace with all of the Muslim and Arab world, which I think we're getting there, but there is still a lot of hostility towards Jews and Israel, and yeah, it's a very sad situation.
So the Abraham Agreement, the recent agreement between Israel and 3 Arab countries, can you talk us through that?
Yeah.
What it is, who's involved, and what changes that's going to make for Israelis?
Yeah, definitely. So Israel, you know, like the left and right in Israel has always been around like the conflict, like the Palestinian conflict. And, you know, like each side had their own arguments, but the main paradigm, like I think since the Oslo Accords, the Oslo Accords were like the agreements with the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, to make the Palestinian Authority. It was very, very contested back then. It was very, very contentious. It's actually what led to the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. We just had, I think, like 2 days ago, it was like the day where we remember. It's like a national remembrance day. It was 25 years ago exactly. It was very contested, and basically the paradigm I think was mostly held by the left, because then the left was in power, Rabin was in power, is if we want to get to the Arab world, we have to make peace with the Palestinians. It's like Palestinians had like the veto power, and I think the paradigm shift that happened now, I think mostly to the credit of Benjamin Netanyahu, was the change where no. We shouldn't we can't rely on the Palestinians. If we make Israel strong militarily, technologically, we should go to the Arab circles, and then maybe the Palestinians will come to their senses. Like we can't rely on on some very childish and immature politicians who are making like profit or profiting off the conflict to make peace with us. So. I think Benjamin Netanyahu is very pragmatist in the sense that his worldview is very like realpolitik. It's very much similar to what's the name of the American diplomat, Kissinger's worldview. It sees countries as having similar interests, and I think this was kind of like the psychological barrier that was broken with these accords, because these accords were considered to be by many people in Israel, mainly the left, as impossible. I mean, like they said, you're never going to have an accord with an Arab country before you solve the Palestinian issue. And I think this paradigm is finally changed with these new agreements. So that's very exciting.
So can you break down the ins and outs of the actual agreement?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to understand like what these agreements are based on. So first of all, they're based on security issues. I mean, Iran is a main threat to the region. Iran, like if I were to describe it briefly for your listeners, the Middle East is kind of in a state of a Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So Iran is Shia Muslim and Saudi Arabia is Sunni Muslim. And Iran has proxies all over the region. So it funds like a lot of terrorist organizations that destabilize countries. So Hezbollah, which is like a terrorist organization in Lebanon, or Hamas, also like an enemy of Israel. The Houthis in Yemen, and other like militia groups in Iraq. So Iran has got like a lot of influence in the Middle East, and it it also has like a serious threat to destabilizing the Gulf countries, which are Sunni and also tend to be more programmatic and closer to the West. I mean, UAE, which was the first country to announce its normalization with Israel, is, you know, it's got like a lot of Western tourism. It's got like the Burj Khalifa, which is like the tallest building in the world. So it's like very, you know, like modern and very close to the West. So first of all, it's the security threat from Iran, which was one of the things that really led the countries to come and join kind of like the Israeli camp, or like you know, the camp that like is opposed to terror and to Iran's influence.
So has that sparked an opposite reaction for Israeli-Iran relations?
Well, you know, Iran is like kind of like the number one enemy of Israel. I mean, Iran, you know, it says it has like the two devils, like the big Satan, which is America, and the little Satan, which is Israel. I mean, in Iran, like when like you've got like protests and people are like mad, like they scream death to Israel. Although it's mainly the regime that is, you know, like very hostile to Israel and publicly claims that it wants to destroy it, and you know, like there was recently with the Twitter scandal, you know, with Jack Dorsey going to Congress. They talked about how Khomeini, like the supreme leader of Iran, like he denies the Holocaust on Twitter, and like he calls like for the murder of Jews and you know, the destruction of Israel. So it's like I don't know of any other country that's openly calling for the destruction of another country,
Yeah.
like all over the world, not just like the Western world, any part of the world. So I
And
think
what Jack Dorsey asked to censor it, or whether he should be censoring it, or
yeah, like they said, you're basically censoring like stories that are bad for Biden, but you're allowing the supreme leader of Iran call for like deny the
yeah.
Holocaust and say stuff like that. So yeah, like he had a really funny answer. Like it's really, it's worth a watch. It was really funny. So yeah, so I think it's mainly like the shared security interest. Also, those Arab countries have also suffered from Palestinian terrorism. I mean, recently I watched some of the talks with like Arab journalists to see like kind of their point of view with the accords, and I didn't know that, but the Palestinian terrorism, you know, it reached all over the world. It wasn't just in Israel, and obviously you've got like some international incidents, but you know, like the Palestinian movements also assassinated like the UAE's ambassador to Paris in '84, and it killed like their foreign minister. So they also suffered from Palestinian terrorism, and I think the paradigm shift is they realized that their relationship with the Palestinians was basically the Palestinian leadership always asking for money and kind of trying to profit off the conflict, kind of to, you know, trying to capitalize on it. And, you know, the Palestinian leadership has been always very corrupt. I mean, all of the leaders from Arafat to Abbas, they're billionaires. These guys have like cars and like penthouses in Qatar, and like, you know, like they don't invest it in the Palestinian people. Kind of the Palestinian people are hostages to a very corrupt Palestinian leadership that has no interest of solving the conflict. It's using the conflict to profit. And I think the pragmatic Gulf states realized that they're not getting anything for their relationship with the Palestinians, and you know, they also get some terror and they get nothing from it. So I think they realized that um, it's better for their interest to normalize relations with Israel, and I think that's like the main breakthrough with these agreements.
So there's the UAE, and then within the agreement, there's also Sudan.
No, so now the Abraham Accords, they were announced in August. They were signed on the 15th of September. It included two countries, the UAE and Bahrain. And recently, like I think like a week ago or 10 days ago, I'm not sure already, I'm losing count. The states announced that Israel will also normalize relations with Sudan. Which is a bit from like different considerations. I mean, in Israel, we have a saying, warm peace and cold peace. So Israel is in peace with Egypt and Jordan for mainly for security reasons. But the agreements were, on the diplomatic level. Like, it's not like the people themselves are still very hostile. I mean, we didn't have many tourists from like Jordan or Egypt coming to Israel. We had a lot of Israelis going the other way, but it's mainly like Israel is still very seen in a very, very negative light in these places. Like, you didn't want to say you're Israeli in these places, and in Sudan it's very similar to that. But in UAE and Bahrain, since these countries have never been, like in conflict with Israel, I think the perception is much more pragmatic and less hostile. People are very happy, both here and in the UAE and Bahrain.
Okay. So, what are the main? So you're saying the main functions and benefits from these agreements are going to be increased security, right? So
and trade, of course, like the
so there's an
UAE.
economic perspective as well.
Yeah. I mean, the UAE and Bahrain, Israel is called the startup nation because, like, in Tel Aviv, they're the second largest amount of startups per capita, other than the Silicon Valley. That's why it's called it's in slang they call it the Silicon Valley. Valley is like a valley in Arabic. Yeah. So a lot of them want like Israeli tech, also like military tech and also startups, and there have been like many economic and trade agreements that were signed, and it's been like going on so quickly. I mean, imagine the agreements were signed like 6 weeks ago, and I'll show you something. This is the paper from Friday. I don't know if you can see it. One sec.
Sort of, you've got your background there.
Here, can you see it? Oh shit! One sec. Anyways, it shows like trips to UAE. Here, now I'll show you. This is like a trip to.
Okay, so tourism.
Yeah. And it's got like another page. It's like really quick. I mean, but I don't know if you can tell, but that's like Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
So everyone's
and before that, there was no travel.
No, there was no travel, and that's in my opinion like very, very exciting. It's really warming the heart to see people like getting closer. And it's two-sided. It's not like only the Israelis are happy about it, because I think Israel, like one of its main, I think like the Israeli ethos in many ways was its longing for peace. It's like all of Israelis like want peace so bad, and like all of them are really happy. And many of the times, like when peace agreements were signed with like Egypt and Jordan, the people that were not happy about it, like they still saw Israel as like an enemy, and like the Zionist entity in a region that we want to get rid of. And it's very it makes me really happy to see like these countries actually being happy about it. With Sudan, it's actually closer to like the cold agreements with Egypt and Jordan. I mean, the people there don't really like Israel. It's mainly for like the regime has like its own reasons. And if you want, I'll talk more about it.
Yeah, please.
So Sudan was kind of was really hostile to Israel. I mean, Israel after
because there was a bit of controversy, right? But I think America, you'll have to correct me on this, declared Sudan as a rogue state or something, and then changed that recently.
Yes. So the Sudanese, for many years, they're really heavily involved in terror activities. It was it was considered a rogue state, kind of like a terrorist sponsoring nation, and it earned that title very justly. I mean, a lot of the terrorist attacks in the 90s on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were coming from Sudan. A lot of terrorists like found kind of like a safe haven in Sudan, like that's where they hid. And Sudan has been like a major player in Israel's wars. I mean, it sent like militias both in like the Independence War and also in the 73 war. And actually, Sudan was really known in Israel for its declaration after the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War was like a very pivotal moment for Israel. Israel was attacked like from all sides by like I think like 5 Arab armies, and it won the war in 6 days. That's why it's called the Six-Day War, and it conquered the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and Judea and Samaria. And back then, Israel, tried to negotiate like some agreement with Arab countries, and the Arab League, it went to Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and it's very famous for saying the 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. So it's like that's what Sudan has been known in Israel for. So it's very exciting to see the change. And I think Sudan has a lot to gain from the agreement, and also Israel. I mean, the rockets and missiles we were talking earlier about that are coming from the Gaza Strip, from Hamas, they're actually smuggled, like they're sent by Iran and other like terrorist groups, and they're smuggled through Sudan to Egypt and like through the tunnels. So now with like Sudan normalizing relations with Israel, Israel has like a lot to gain from kind of monitoring all of the equipment and making sure that no weapons are smuggled through Sudan. And Sudan is kind of broke, so it's already signed like an agreement with Israel, an agricultural agreement, and Sudan. Actually, this agreement, which is like kind of like a trilateral agreement with the states, it was Israel bringing the states in to this agreement, and like the previous ones, like UAE agreement and Bahrain, it was kind of Jared Kushner wanted to gain like some accomplishments, so he was the one kind of mediating the entire thing. Yeah.
So now it's an Israeli initiative.
In Sudan, with Sudan, yeah.
This agreement,
yeah. It's like the Israel brought the states, and like Sudan really needed the states to get it off its terrorist sponsor list.
And there was a lot of controversy a couple of months ago about the annexation of the West Bank.
Yeah.
And so, can you talk to us about that? And then also, I think this agreement has had an effect.
Yeah.
On that as well.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know, but the past year and a half, more than a year and a half, almost 2 years, has been very unstable in the Israeli political system. We had 3 elections in like 11 months, which was unprecedented. They just couldn't make a government, so we went to a never-ending election cycle. So Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the head of the Likud party, and it's a right-wing
What party, sorry?
Likud. It's called Likud party. And he wanted, as part of his election campaign, he was trying to appear as more right-wing. So it's like very right-wing thing in Israel, like to want to annex the West Bank or parts of it. So in his campaign, he said that he promised to annex the Jordan Valley, which is like the part where it borders Jordan. It's not like the entire West Bank. It's like 12% of it, I think, or something like that. It's I'm not sure exactly what was like his plan, but it was after the Trump peace initiative, which also included like some annexation of the West Bank, and he promised that if he gets elected, that's what he'll do. And I personally, I think it was kind of like a political spin. I don't think he would have done it, but it used like the peace agreement with the UAE. Part of the agreement is that Israel wouldn't annex that part. So this gives the UAE kind of like credit points in the Arab world. Look, we stopped like the annexation. We're like still like for the Palestinians. I'm obviously, you know, simplifying the message, but that's like kind of like the simplistic message. And Bibi is like, okay, look, I brought you the peace plan. And in my opinion, he never planned to annex it. So it kind of gives him an excuse to be off the hook for like, because a lot of right wingers are like really pissed at him. It's like, why didn't you annex it? And I think it's like, he's very clever. He's a very clever guy. Like as a politician I think you can study him as like the the perfect political mastermind.
Right, strategist. What was America's role, and specifically Trump's role, in this agreement?
So the Americans have historically been very, very involved with like all of the peace agreements. I mean, the peace agreement with Egypt, which was signed in '79, it was in the White House. It was with Carter, with Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat. Also, the peace agreement with Jordan was Yitzhak Rabin, was Bill Clinton, and King Abdallah. Sorry, King Hussein. Abdallah is his son, now the king. So these agreements are, you know, always around security issues, and obviously it's very, very important who's in the White House. The Americans play a very, very large role, and it's also very unclear what's going to happen with the next peace agreements which are planned, depending on what happens in 3 days or how long it takes
The
them
American election.
to count the votes. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen this election, but I don't think it's going to be. We're not going to know the results on November 3rd. From my understanding, you know, like many diplomats talked about it, this entire peace initiative was the making of Jared Kushner and you know his team. Jared Kushner was the one, like, is the brain behind this entire agreement. And I think it was kind of the change of paradigm of trying to talk to the Arab countries about their interests. And I think the Arab countries realized that this peace agreement is very beneficial to them. And also, you have to remember that the peace agreement with the UAE, they're going to get F-35s. It's one of the most advanced planes like in the markets, and there was like a big controversy over like them getting the F-35 planes from the States, because Israel has historically been given an advantage like in its military tech. It's called QME, Qualitative Military Edge, which has been part of American policymaking since the 60s. You know, like if you're going to give Israel like the best tech, you should give like the Arab countries surrounding it like tech that's like a bit downgraded, like not as good. So there's been a big controversy because it's like it's an insane plane. I mean, the F-35, it's like a moving unit of like intelligence gathering. It's not just a plane. It's a plane that can land like vertically. It can land like this. I've seen videos of it. Like I'm no military strategist, but from what I've understood, it's like, you know, an insane plane.
So the reason I asked what was Trump's role in the agreement is because there's been a bit of controversy of why this agreement hasn't really been talked about so much in the media, despite its significance. And do you think that there is a part of that is because the Republican Party had something to do with the negotiation?
You mean in the American media or like in what country?
Yeah. In Western media.
Well, look, I think it depends on the country. I mean, I guess it's, look, Trump is like, personally, I'm not going to hide it. I don't like Trump and most of his policies. And I think I understand why people like, you know, kind of want to discredit him. But I think that it's important, you know, even politicians that you're not necessarily very fond of, it's very important that you give them the credit when they deserve it. I mean, you should criticize them when they deserve it, but you should also give them the credit when they deserve it. So I guess it's also part of it is because, you know, the media doesn't like Trump and the Republican Party. And I think it's also part of it is because we're in the midst of a pandemic. So I guess it's it would have gotten more coverage if we would have been in normal times.
Mm.
Um,
I
I
think
think
so much of it is also identity politics nowadays. Like
yeah,
the election, what we're seeing in the election, like in the debates, is just, it's so immature. None of it is
definitely.
really about policy. Like the fact that a lot of media sources won't talk about this agreement just because it has relations to Trump is
Definitely.
ridiculous, in my opinion. Like, why can we just leave the personalities out of it? And it goes the same way against Biden. Everyone's talking about how he can't remember anything, or he's an old man, or whatever. But like, when no one's talking about policy.
I think one of the troubling things of our time is like the polarization and the politics is that when you politicize issues that we should agree on, like we should agree that peace is good, you should make it a
Yeah,
political issue. And also it's been kind of a political issue even with some Israelis, like the more extremes. And I think it's one of the things that is most counterproductive for all countries. States is especially polarized. So I think I think if people become more moderate, I think it's also going to provide a very good platform for discussions on the consensus, what we all agree on.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so what are your thoughts on the future of Israeli-Arab relations? Do you see this as a good step towards crushing that conflict to some extent, or how do you see things progressing in the future?
So I think that it's very dependent on what's going to happen in this election, who's going to be in the White House. I think it's going to affect it because, as I've said, the Americans have a very, very large role in the peacemaking process. And
Mm-hmm.
in diplomacy, it's very important that you build ties. So I suppose if Biden gets elected, uh, Jared Kushner is not going to be part of the team. And, he's already been negotiating with like other leaders and, other leaders have like, there are more countries coming. The Saudi foreign minister, he said, I think, to in some interview that like he said, we're going to normalize relations. It's just a question of when, and all of the Arab countries, that are like in the process of normalizing relations and are like talking in secret. They're following up the elections very closely because it's very dependent on who's in the White House. I think that uh, the like the barrier has been broken, and I think you can't undo that. And I think more countries will come, and it's because of shared interests. You asked me also about the Palestinians. I think eventually, like in the next 100 years, I suppose the conflict will end. I don't know when, but like eventually it will end. I don't think it will end in the next 10 years or 20 years, at least
Yeah,
not with this leadership. I think the Palestinian leadership has been the main cause of suffering to the Palestinian people. The Palestinian leadership, not only, as I've said, it's corrupt and taking like the funds from the people, but it's been very rejectionist and unpragmatic. It's not like willing to negotiate, and in past negotiations, I'll give you an example. In 2007, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, he negotiated with Abbas, like the current Palestinian president, and one of the diplomats, Say Barikat, he said, "You're giving us 100%, but we want more." And I think unless Palestinian leadership will start recognizing Israel as a legitimate state, as a Jewish state that has a right to exist and are willing to actually negotiate on things that Israel can agree on, I don't think we'll move on. I'm saying it like I'm very sad about it. I'm not happy. I'm really sad, but
yeah,
I think that's the case. I think also you have to see what's going on with the Palestinian leadership because Abbas is like 85 years old. He's very old and he's not in good health. So it depends on who's going to be the next leader. So it depends on a lot of things, but I really believe in what's called economic peace. When people, realize that peace is to their advantage economically, and they make the peace not because they love Israel, but they understand the economic prospects of having peace with Israel. So that's like my belief in policy.
Cool. Last thing, have you seen the new Borat movie?
How do I say in Hebrew what?
Have you seen the new Borat film?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear that.
Have you seen the new Borat movie?
Oh, the Borat
2?
movie, of course. I've seen it
Because
actually.
a lot of people don't know that Sacha Baron Cohen is actually Jewish, right?
Yeah. It's like I think like he could get away with like the things he says only because he's Jewish, and I think also Jews have a lot of like kind of like self humor. And I've watched the Borat movie twice already, and I don't know, like I think another friend wants to watch it, so I might watch it the third time. Every time he speaks Kazakh, he speaks Hebrew. Like I don't know if you know
Really?
that. So
Yeah,
Israelis can understand that. And like like his daughter Tutar, she's Belarusian, so she speaks Belarusian. And in the previous movies, like Azamat, he speaks Armenian. So it's it's just an
Right.
interesting fact.
All right, Atar, thank you so much for today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for this invitation.
No problem. Make sure to follow the Rocky Road Post on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.